The 3D printer. Don't know why they don't just give up, thought Bryant as he read over the latest letter from a local storytelling group. They were asking for payments for services rendered at a recent concert, and Bryant had been holding back just as long as he could. Just write it off, that's what they ought to do. That would certainly help my budget, he thought, as he tossed the letter down on his desk. Edgar Bryant was the business manager for the Oakmont Plantation, an historic house in Middle Tennessee, near to the Kentucky border. He was a frugal man who objected to what he considered frivolous expenses, generated mostly by the plantation's director. Now this, he said to himself as he picked up an invoice for a new piece of equipment. A 3D printer, he said. Why do we need this? The sophisticated piece of equipment had been recommended by Brian Evans, an employee in the plantation's maintenance department. As well as being a competent handyman, Evans was also a highly skilled carpenter who loved to make period pieces. He would demonstrate his skills at some of the plantation's public events, such as the Heritage Days. And he would make furniture in the style of the early 1800s, using the same techniques and, where possible, similar materials that were used in the past. But Evans had noticed that this was becoming more difficult. He complained to the director that there was one item that it was now almost impossible to find. Surprisingly, that item was nails. And he mentioned that many of the antique furniture makers throughout Tennessee were having similar difficulties. He commented that there could be a market if someone found out how to make these nails identical to those made in the past. Modern nails were just too perfect to match the rough surface of the old pig iron nails after 200 years of use and misuse. Obviously, a blacksmith would be able to make pig iron nails. However, those with the necessary expertise were hard to find. Also, the nails would lack the antiqued surface. The director was intrigued with the idea and had spoken to an expert in the field of 3D printers, who had advised her to buy a Replicator 2 from Futurescope Industries. This was a little expensive, costing nearly $2,000, but would provide for precision manufacture of industrial and craft parts. She was told that the unit could use a variety of materials, including high-strength industrial plastics specifically tailored to match the color of the old nails. These materials came on a roll of very fine filaments that the unit would cast onto a metal plate. The Replicator 2 used a multi-directional spinning head to inject a single layer of plastic, and then repeated the process over and over to build a three-dimensional object as directed by the unit's built-in computer. Of course, the design of the object to be built had to be coded in by scanning the item to be replicated. A volunteer from the Friends of Oakmont, by the name of Gareth Williams, offered to take care of that. Once completed, Williams also installed the software into the Replicator 2 and helped with the initial setup. The printer was placed in the kitchen of the plantation's visitor center, next to the business manager's office. Bryant objected, but was overruled by the director as it was the logical place for it. Williams switched it on and sat back to watch the first nail being produced. It was a fascinating but slow process. The plastic filament was gradually drawn into the machine, melted, and extruded through the spinning head. He was surprised how noisy the process was as the head spun and whirled through its various axes. It emitted a variety of squeaks and rumbles that some have described as chirps. It certainly made its presence felt. It took almost 2 hours for the nail to be completed. 2 hours of repeated application of thin layers of melted plastic onto the growing form. Once complete, The nail was identical to its 200-year-old prototype, even to the dings and dents and other damage caused through its long period of use. Evans, who had come to watch this initial production, was thrilled. He was later surprised when he tested the nail out on an old piece of oak, that it withstood the pounding and battering needed to drive it through the hardened timber. He contacted a number of his colleagues in the antique carpentry network and soon had requests for over 2,000 nails. And this was just in the Middle Tennessee area. Sales across the South, where much of the antique carpentry craft was practiced, could be substantially higher. He subsequently told Bryant, the business manager, that his fellow carpenters were willing to pay $2 per nail. Clearly, given more time, the Replicator 2 could pay for itself and cover production costs. And so, Oakmont went into the antique nail business. Williams, as he watched the initial production attempts, came up with some significant process improvements. Ultimately, he was able to make about 10 nails a day, and this was just during the 8 hours when Evans was able to keep an eye on the unit. Evans felt that they could make many more nails if he ran around the clock, but he wouldn't recommend leaving the unit unattended until they had much more experience with it. Initially, the Replicator 2 ran very smoothly, almost effortlessly, other than to change filament spools as necessary. But one day, there was the first sign of trouble ahead. Evans had taken responsibility to maintain the filament supply and also to keep the unit clean. One morning, he walked into the business manager's office and asked, "Mr. Bryant, has anyone been using a 3D printer?" "Not that I know of," replied Bryant. "Why?" "Well, when I came in this morning, there was some powder on the printer's casting plate. I know I cleaned the unit after yesterday's production." "Don't know what to say," said the manager. "Just keep an eye on it." The next day, Evans contacted Bryant as soon as he walked into the visitor center. "Happened again," said the very agitated maintenance man. "But even worse. Look at this." And he handed Bryant what looked like a dull ivory-colored bangle. "I'm mystified. This doesn't make sense," he said. Bryant took the bangle and slipped it on his wrist. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed. That's horrible. It feels like it's sucking all the warmth out of my body." And he wrenched the bangle off his wrist and threw it onto the floor. "We've got to get to the bottom of this," he told Evans. "Get Williams back in." So Evans called Gareth Williams and explained the situation, and the man agreed to meet with him later that day. When he arrived, he checked out the unit and was all surprised, almost unbelieving that somehow the Replicator had made such a strange item. He even volunteered to watch the unit overnight to see if the same thing would happen again. But Evans had an even better idea. He suggested that they move the printer to the visitor center shop, where there was a fixed surveillance camera that could monitor the unit. And that was easily done, and the men left the 3D printer with a camera trained on it overnight. And with that, Evans shut the shop door, and they all went home. He returned to the visitor center early the next morning, anxious to see if there was any further evidence of someone tampering with the 3D printer. As he entered the lobby, he was immediately struck by the noise. It sounded as if the printer was running in overdrive. The squeaks, the rumbles, and the chirps were almost deafening. He quickly ran to the shop and tried to open the door, but without success. In desperation, he shook the handle violently, but still couldn't open it. By this time, Bryant had arrived, and he also tried to open the door, and also wasn't able to. "That sounds like the printer's running," said Bryant, "but I've never heard it so loud. What's going on?" "I've no idea," replied Evans, "but I know how we can find out. The surveillance camera controller's in the library. We can check the tape." And with that, they both ran to the library at the back of the visitor center, opened the cabinet that held the controller, and activated the video display. Both men gasped as they viewed the scene inside the shop. The 3D printer was indeed running at exceptional speed, but it was the model that was being produced that horrified them. It was a dull ivory color similar to the bangle produced the previous day, but much larger. They realized that this was far more than a simple wrist bracelet. This was more like a neck with a promontory jutting out of it that was clearly a chin. And as they watched, the 3D printer's spinning head began to lay down a row of teeth, dirty, yellow-brown, grinning teeth. Evans grabbed the phone and rapidly called Williams. "Mr. Williams, get down here immediately. Something terrible's happening. The replicator is building a skull. Hurry, please hurry." By the time Williams arrived, the thing now had a grotesque nose cavity and was beginning to build eye sockets. He had quickly assessed the situation and yelled, "We've got to shut it down." "We can't," said Bryant. "We can't get into the shop." "I'll take care of that," said Evans, who made a rush towards the door and threw his shoulder into it. The door splintered and the man tumbled into the room. He stood, and approaching the printer, he reached for the power cord. But as he did so, the now nearly completed skull swiveled on its base, and twin beams of energy surged out of its eye sockets. The beams skidded over Evans's shoulder and hit the businessman full in the chest, throwing him against the wall. Though winded, he did manage to gasp, "The main switch! Turn off the main switch!" "I'll get it," said Evans, who rushed out to the side of the building and threw the master switch. The printer immediately shut down, but not before the skull issued a hideous, piercing shriek and then collapsed into a mound of ivory powder. Evans called the police and also the emergency rescue squad to check on Bryant. He also secured the surveillance video, realizing that they may have difficulty convincing people of the situation. Ultimately, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations was called in. They sent their special operations team to try and determine what had happened. During that investigation, they took samples of the ivory powder for analysis. It took several weeks for the TBI to complete their analysis, and during that time, the printer remained unplugged and life began to return to normal. Normal, that is, except for the business manager. Since he'd been hit by the strange energy beams, Bryant had become progressively more morose and hostile. His personal hygiene had also deteriorated, and he allowed a beard to grow, a scraggly, unkempt, ugly growth. And his clothing appeared essentially unwashed, and he'd taken to wearing an old leather satchel, a satchel that he never removed. When the TBI's analysis was complete, they met with the plantation staff and reviewed their results. Astonishingly, this analysis showed that the powder was essentially calcium-based, even though none of the feedstocks contained this type of material. Further, much to the surprise of everyone, including the TBI, the powder also contained traces of DNA, human DNA. Mystified, the TBA took additional samples, including cheek swabs of all members of the plantation staff, including the business manager, much to his strong objections, and also from Williams. Even though the TBI analyzed these samples on a priority basis, it still took several weeks. During this time, Bryant's appearance and attitude had noticeably worsened, and he clutched his old satchel to his side tightly, almost as if it was an appendage. The TBI gathered all the staff and Williams together to announce their results. They confirmed that the powder did indeed contain human DNA, and they also announced that the DNA was identical to that of one of the staff members, Edgar Bryant. With that, Bryant, standing at the back of the group, snarled, "No!" and rushed forward towards the TBI man. In the process, he brushed past Evans, unbalancing him and nearly knocking him over. Evans grabbed at Bryant to prevent from falling, and inadvertently pulled at Bryant's satchel, yanking it free. And this exposed a power cord leading from the satchel directly into Bryant's side, a cord that had become dislodged in the collision between the two men. Bryant screamed with rage. It was a hideous, piercing scream, not unlike that uttered by the 3D printer. But more horrifying was the appearance of Bryant's face. It began to crumble to a dull ivory powder. And then the man's whole body collapsed into a heap of powder, mingled with his now useless clothing. Neither the TBI nor anyone else was able to solve the mystery. But life had to go on, and the plantation again returned slowly to normal operation. A new business manager was hired to replace Bryant, and he found Bryant's affairs in total disarray, including his desk. And one of the items the new man found was a discarded letter from a local storytelling group asking for payment. Not wishing to emulate his predecessor in any way, the new man promptly paid the bill. And that's the story of the 3D printer.